Hey, today we're going to talk about 6.6, nuclear power. So take a moment, check out the Enduring Understanding, look at the learning objectives, pause the video, review the essential knowledge, and set up your Cornell notes. So when you were talking about nuclear energy, nuclear reactions, some of this will be a review from chemistry class. And if you don't remember it or you didn't take chemistry, it's okay. But just make sure you're paying extra special attention because this likes to show up a lot on the test, and especially the math that is associated. So focus on that. Now, nuclear power involves the process of nuclear fission, and that's when you're hitting a uranium-235. You're hitting a uranium-235 nucleus with a neutron, and that basically causes a chain reaction. It breaks apart into two other substances. We have barium and krypton. Now this can change depending on the type of nucleus that you're using, but it releases a lot of energy, a lot. And it also releases two neutrons, so then these neutrons go bump into another nucleus and bump into another nucleus and another one, and it causes a chain reaction. Now this is a huge amount of energy, so if this were allowed to, if you had just a big mass of uranium atoms, these neutrons are going to bump into them all, and you're going to have a huge amount of energy release. Now that energy, if you can't harness it, it's basically wasted because now you're breaking this apart and then you're not collecting the energy. So when we are generating electricity through nuclear power, we have to have a couple of things that we implement in order to kind of control that. So this looks very similar. In fact, this portion over here looks very similar to the other types of electricity generation. Now, the only thing different is in a nuclear power plant is we have this containment structure, which is typically made out of concrete or reinforced steel, something in there that's going to protect it if there is a big explosion. So this uranium-235 is placed into fuel rods, and these fuel rods contain all of these uranium-235 atoms. Now, in order to make sure that this doesn't continue with a huge chain reaction and a huge explosion, they have control rods that basically go in between the fuel rods to stop the reactions, to stop the neutrons from causing more fission reactions. So the control rods and the fuel rods work together, but they are generating enough energy to heat up the water, just like we did in other types of electricity generation. We're heating up the water to generate steam, which then goes into a turbine, which spins a turbine. The turbine spins a generator. The generator's a bunch of magnets, spins around really fast, and generates the electricity. We also have a cooling tower, and we also have access to the water, and there may be a reservoir, like a lake or a river, where we obtain our water. But in order to do that, we have to cool the water first, which is why we have this cooling tower. So things that are going to be different in nuclear electricity generation is the control rods, the fuel rods. Again, the control rods are to stop the neutrons from bombarding other uranium atoms and uranium nuclides or nucleus. And it is kind of keeping that reaction in check. The other thing is you're going to have this containment structure. So there's a few differences. Obviously the fuel is different. A few differences that you will see, but for the most part, once you get the steam, everything else is pretty much the same. Now, when we're calculating a half-life, there's different ways that you can calculate it. I don't know how you learned it in chemistry. The way I like to do it is graphically. There is a formula you can follow where it has like logarithmic functions and all that stuff. There is a way you can do it on the calculator. I'm not teaching it because it doesn't make sense to me. I'm teaching it this way. So we always start out with 100%. And this is just graphically showing you what that looks like. Also, we have the total time elapsed. So from start to the finish. Now, after X amount of years, or one half-life, we have half of the substance remaining. 50%, one half. Look at that. This is a graphical, a little diagram showing half. Now after another half-life, we're going to have 25%. And then the next half-life will have 12.5%. The next half-life, we got 6.25%, then we got 3.125%, and so on and so forth. Now, each one of these, the half-lives is going to be the same. So 1 half-life, 2 half-lives, 3 half-lives, 4 half-lives, 5 half-lives, and the total time elapsed are the same. Like, this total time was contained in 5 half-lives. So if I have the total time elapsed, all I need to do is divide it by 5 to get the timing in 1 half-life. If I know that there's 5 half-lives, and maybe this total time elapsed was my unknown, I take 1 half-life times 5 to get my total time. So we'll look at a practice problem right now. We're dealing with uranium-235, and this is the half-life of uranium-235. So the question reads, if 5 grams of uranium-235 remains after 3.5 billion years, how much uranium was initially present? So we're going to set this up. So I know that I have 5 grams at the end, and I know that this was 3.5 billion years, the total. What I really want is the amount that was right here. So what I have to do is I have to figure out how many half-lives go into, if this is 7.0 times 10 to the 8 is 3 point, and it goes into 3.5 times 10 to the 9th. Well, this, if I divide all this, if I divide these two, this would actually be equal to 7, and this would be equal to 35. That's a pretty straightforward number. How many times does 7 go into 35? Goes in 5 times. So I know that we have 5 half-lives, and each of these half-lives is equal to the same amount of time. So now I want to figure out how much we had initially. So basically all I want to do is I just want to jump across over here and double it each time. So if I start out with 5 grams, I know 700 million years earlier, I have 10 grams, then I have 20 grams, now 40 grams, 80 grams. My answer is 160 grams. And that we're going to do other practice problems that are related to half-lives where different parts of this are going to be the unknown. All right, but once we generate the electricity from the uranium-235, that nuclear radioactive uranium, or what's remaining of that, is spent nuclear waste. And the problem with this is it's still radioactive, which means it can cause mutations in DNA. It can lead to cancer in different organisms. So this is a major problem. So what we've done is this has to be stored on site. So if you generate the electricity at a nuclear power plant, you're storing it on site. It has to be stored underwater. And the reason for that is because water has a very high specific heat. Water can absorb a lot of energy without actually increasing in temperature. And since this is still radioactive, there is still reactions occurring here. This will still release heat. So it's under the water to kind of keep it, the temperature relatively stable. This entire process is very expensive. So it is expensive because there's a lot of safety requirements. Now, there was a planned location to store nuclear waste in the deserts of Nevada and in a place called Yucca Mountain, which was very secluded, very low population density. People didn't live around there. However, it was shrouded in controversy. It was planned in the 90s, I believe, but officially during the Obama administration is when the entire project was canceled. So it just makes a lot more sense to store all of the spent nuclear waste on site. All right, so there are environmental impacts of nuclear power. So the spent fuel is radioactive. It can still release subatomic particles, and it can still it releases radiation, which can still cause cancer if people are exposed to it. It can also damage anything that contains DNA. So any living organism could be damaged by this spent fuel. The mine tailings from the mining of the uranium, the mine tailings are just as toxic as with any other type of mining. So this is another environmental impact. Definitely can contribute to acid mine drainage, which was a major impact of mining. The amount of water that is used is very high. We don't want to release this water back into a body of water wherever we obtained it from, because it can contribute to thermal pollution. And also, warm water holds less oxygen. So in this, if the water is warmer when we return it back to a lake or a river, you can cause the dissolved oxygen content to decrease, which means fish could die from lack of oxygen. Again, the entire enrichment process to enrich this uranium, to get it from, to get the uranium-235 built up, is a very long and expensive process, and any sort of manufacturing or any of these enrichment processes can also use up a lot of resources as well. Now, there are three major nuclear power plant disasters, and I'm going to talk about them. 3 Mile Island was in Pennsylvania. It was in the 1980s. And what happened was their cooling water valve was closed, but then the cooling water led to a partial meltdown, and nothing really happened, but it was a precaution that they evacuated 200,000 people. They don't know really 100%. There was some leaking of radiation. However, they may have increased infant mortality rates and cancer rates, but that is up for debate. Now, the worst one in the history of the world is from Chernobyl, and that was in the Ukraine. And you see this big explosion here. Basically, they disconnected the cooling system and they removed the control rods. So when you remove the control rods, you're going to have this chain reaction, and eventually the plant overheated and caused a huge explosion and fire. This was the containment system, exploded. 31 people died, and then many more died of radiation poisoning, because the radiation, again, contributes to mutations in your DNA, which is leading to cancer. So this happened in 1986, I think it was 86, and it's still, this entire area around the Chernobyl power plant is still off limits because of radiation poisoning. And the winds blew the radiation to other areas, so it contaminated areas that were, dozens or hundreds of miles away. Definitely contaminated the crops and the milk, and the results were seen many years after the actual incident. And the most recent one was in Fukushima in Japan, and this one likes to show up a lot on tests. It happened in 2011. It was, first of all, it was an earthquake that triggered a tsunami. So the earthquake shifted the tectonic plates. The tsunami was because the tectonic plates displaced a bunch of water and made a huge 15-meter wave. That's like almost 50 feet higher, 50-foot high wave. And this caused major flooding. And then there was an interruption of the power supply, and then the release of these gases caused a major explosion and released radioactive gases, and 100,000 people were evacuated. The results or the impact was seen for hundreds of miles, and Fukushima is the most recent nuclear disaster. Now, what's the biggest takeaway? The biggest takeaway from Chernobyl is there was a problem with the control rods. The biggest takeaway from Fukushima is that there was an earthquake, then a tsunami, and then an explosion. So here's what I want you to do to practice. There's actually two parts to this. So I want you to identify and describe one component from a nuclear power plant that's also present in a coal-fired power plant. And then I want you to identify and describe one component that is not present in a coal-fired power plant. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope that this was informative. I will see you soon.